Very welcome to everybody, and thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon to really share with you the long-awaited SATSA guidelines on animal interactions. It's a culmination of an exhaustive and a fascinating process that SATSA has undertaken, and I think everybody is going to get something out of this afternoon. Before we go, just a warm word of welcome to all of you, but in particular to our former Minister of Tourism, Derek Hanekom, who is so he's when he finished, he could he had some choices. But he didn't ultimately go back to Parliament. But today he's on the back benches, so we may have some heckling and some booing and farting from the back there. So it's all gonna come from him. And then I'd like to welcome Mashoto and the team from SA Tourism. As I'll explain, the whole initiative is been done in conjunction with South African tourism. So. Quickly, how did we end up here? Why are you here this afternoon? So 2017, as a country that really has prided itself in terms of wildlife conservation at a broad level, we found ourselves oddly behind the eight ball in terms of what was going on with animal interactions, and not pervasively at all around the country, but we had one particular operator who ended up using an SA Tourism platform on an international show and sort of claiming that their accreditation enabled them to be the way, the truth, and the light, and everybody else wasn't so kosher, which was it was just unfortunate, not the way we wanted to project ourselves. At the same time, international bodies that send tourists here, so both tour operators as well as sort of online channels, were taking a view on us and our relationship and the way we handled animal interaction. So the Dutch tour operators sort of took a view that any interaction was verboten. The big tour operators, TUI, Virgin Holidays, were all going on. APTA, the British Association, brought out some guidelines. We then had an initiative by Fair Trade. But for me, by far the most telling of those barometers, if you will, was when you went on TripAdvisor, and it was questions about South Africa. The third most asked question was around animal interactions. I mean, it was really, really sort of sobering. So we were in this conundrum. We had the SATSA conference at Spear in 2017, and we scheduled a session on this. And we had a representative panel, including the then CEO of SAT. And this topic was discussed, and we got a very strong mandate from the SATSA membership that SATSA, as a membership compliance organization, should take on this task and have a look at getting an equitable way forward in which we could manage the problem and come up with an equitable set of guidelines that would enable us to go to the international market with confidence and say, here's a way in terms of evaluating what's cool and not, and what is not cool. And it was a total blank canvas. How widely do you scope the study? What does it look on? And how do you sort of ultimately start playing God? Some sort of way, sort of things of riding on elephants, and I'm not taking a view on this, riding on elephants, bad, hanging out with butterflies, totally cool, but why? On what basis? So we put this, we kicked it off, and this process has been funded through the Collaborative Fund, which is the ring-fenced levy collection money, and it's a joint venture between the Tourism Business Council and South African Tourism. But it's been an exhaustive process. So what we did is we formed a board subcommittee. Kira Powers, who you're going to hear from this afternoon, chaired that committee. And she and her committee have worked tirelessly. I can't tell you how, it's just how, it's a sense of pride that this is a shining example of members of an association taking ownership of an issue and coming to the fore. Because so often we hear from people who might be a bit disgruntled or whatever, what's SATSA doing for me or whatever. And here are people who just basically said, what can we do in terms of taking ownership? And Kira, thank you so much. So We went out on a quite an exhaustive and very transparent tender process. Grant Thornton, who are now BDO, were appointed. Leanne Back is the lead consultant. We'll be hearing from her as well. And we did a very exhaustive consultative process, because our view was whatever sort of guidelines or measures that had been undertaken to date had not been sufficiently consultative. So we could have adopted the APTA ones or the fair trade issues, and we thought, no, let's actually go and do this and come up with a uniquely organic South African solution. Simply taking the APTA ones, and one doesn't want to get into sort of inflammatory language, but it's essentially well-meaning, but quite a colonial perspective. We sit in England and we look at this and we say this is what's going to happen. So this is why we've done the process, and it's allowed people on both poles of the debate, and it's been, let me say, there've been some hairy moments. There've been people who feel very passionately on the subject from all quarters, and but I think that what you will see presented this afternoon is a very equitable outcome. It's a very sober outcome. It's a very sort of well thought through outcome, and some amazing frameworks, some amazing perspectives have been unearthed along the way. So we're very proud to present this to you, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kira, or is it Leanne? Who's coming up first? To Kira Paz, who is the chair of the SATSA board subcommittee on animal interactions. Thanks, Kira. Cheers.
Sorry about the voice. David wasn't joking about what this project has taken out of us, and this is where I am on the last day. The last month in particular has been really hectic with this deadline coming up. Those of you who attended any of the workshops that we ran 10 across the 9 provinces, may have heard me speak before, and you may have noticed that I held notes. So I usually hold notes or make notes before I talk. And despite today being probably the biggest moment in this, well, it is the biggest moment for this project, I didn't want to make any notes because we really have come to live and breathe this process. And I thought really what I'm going to tell you is taking you on the journey that we went on to bring to you the findings that we found. So I hope my voice, is it okay? You can hear me, right? Okay, great. So before going into more details, and while everyone is still paying attention, I did want to really focus your attention on the other people involved in this study. I am the only one from the committee that, we were really good with our budget, and we tried not to spend anything that we didn't have. So I'm the only one here. No one else could be flown from Joburg, apart from Leanne, who lives here. Everyone on the committee actually doesn't live in Joburg. So I'm the only one here. But I really want to give a huge amount of credit. I'm going to name the other 4 people on the committee with me because they each made invaluable contributions. Brett Mitchell from the Elephant Reintegration Trust was a powerful figure in our team of 5 with Leanne for all his knowledge in the field of a lifetime of working with wildlife, and especially around legislation and permitting and how our provinces work and how the personalities and the role players and the whole puzzle fits together. You won't know of him because he is a guy that shies away from any limelight. Then there was Gavin Reynolds, who fresh out of an MBA, had a very clear idea of how to structure something that had to encompass so much. And he really kept us on the straight and narrow and really kept us focused on what we didn't even have a word for it, what our results had to look like and be designed, and kept us from wandering off on tangents. Andrea Ferry from Singita has her PhD in sustainability, and she really brought for us a sense of sort of academic work of how to look at this in a very high sort of academic quality manner and do our studies properly. And then there was Peter Dross, who works at Fancourt. He has a background at Mala Mala, and he had a great sense. He was like our barometer and temperature gauge for our industry, for the markets, for our buyers, for tour operators, for DMCs. He's on the board of SATSA. He knows what we were accountable to SATSA for. So that's a bit of a boring stuff, but I just want to take my hat off to all of them. They worked incredibly hard for absolutely nothing in return, not even getting to the launch. All right, so moving on. So that we found ourselves in a room together when we kicked this off with Leanne as the appointed consultant to help us and to do really all the legwork. And we didn't know a lot. We knew we had to research to find out. And what we did know is that there were already guidelines out there. And so we were a bit confused. How come this came to SATSA at our conference in 2017? With such a strong force, why were people so keen on finding answers and wanting answers and being given answers if there were already guidelines out there? So we started to think less about what is the answer we're trying to find for everyone and think more about what is the question being asked. Because clearly these other answers haven't answered the questions people have. So we went into these workshops around the country to listen to people and from our industry to really first, before even trying to think about what we think the answers are, to think about what is the question. Why is South Africa in this position? What are people needing help with? And what are people wanting to know? And we also sent this question abroad. Our consultation was not just domestic, it also went internationally through our networks and everything. And so we did a lot of desktop research and theoretical research and academic research, and then we did a lot of interviews and consultation. And out of that, we started to find our way, because we did go into the saying, we're not coming with a preconceived position, what SATSA should or shouldn't do. We had to find it out by running the project. And so along the way, we started to feel a number of principles were starting to coalesce that we followed and led us in the direction that we ended up taking. So I may have to reference them, but we started to think about why these other guidelines hadn't taken root in our region, and thought, okay, so our guidelines have to hold no matter who's in the room, no matter who this committee is, who this committee comprises, who SATSA is, who might work on this project in the future. It has to hold no matter who's in the room. And how do we achieve that? We realized that in looking at the guidelines that were given, in looking at this complex problem, that there was no silver bullet solution. People couldn't come to SATSA and say, we want you to give us the answer. Your study is going to be the answer, the solution to this issue. The dichotomy of views and the polarized nature of this debate showed that there was never going to be a single answer, and our results, our product, was not going to be the silver bullet. So we started to move forward into a space of thinking, okay, what we can do is move the conversation forward. We're not going to try and be the heroes and solve it. We want to dissect it, and we want to really nail it down, and we want to take our stand and our position and justify why. But that position is not static. It's going to move, and it must move, because we have seen in the period of time we've run this project, 2 years now, that so much has happened. And mostly, like if you think of the last 6 months even, it started to happen faster and faster as this, what we started to call, another principle was this social movement. It's not an animal rights thing. It's not a commercial thing. It's really a social movement that is taking over in the industry across the globe, not just in South Africa, not just targeting South Africa at all either. So we wanted to move this conversation forward. And so the next principle that came is like, well, a movement has to start from somewhere, and also that SATSA will at some point, as leaders of the industry, as trying to be ahead of any curves in the industry, ahead of this wave, to show leadership and to show foresight where our industry might be stuck in the past, we realized we'd have to draw a line. So our strong language around a concept came around this line in the sand. The line in the sand became almost an entity for us, and we speak and we'll present a lot about the line in the sand. What does that line mean? Where did we position it? And what do we expect to happen to it as it moves forward? So that was the next thing, is that what are these forces that we expect will advance the line in the sand? And so that we can assist the industry in adapting and so on in that direction. Then, so with that idea of taking a stand and moving the conversation forward, but primarily that idea of this thing must hold no matter who's in the room, we also realized that we needed something else other than informed opinion as the determinator of what's right or wrong or what we agree with or don't agree with. And the five of us were in no position to say that our opinions were the most relevant or suitable and the ones we were going to use. So we were determined right from the start, and I think we made these announcements in our early workshops without even knowing how we were going to do it, but we were very determined to do it. And this is where Gavin's like dog with a bone attitude came in. Like we had to get this one thing right. And the thing was that we needed an ethical framework to pin this theory on, to pin this outcome on, or this position on, and the tool that we were going to use, the questions we were going to ask, and so on. It had to be pinned on something more than just our opinion. And so we were very determined to find an ethical framework that was the determining factor, so that anybody who ran with this project after us could measure activities or attractions or facilities against the ethics that we had decided were applicable and not our view on what we thought was applicable. So that took a long time to research what is ethics, what are ethical frameworks, what are ethical approaches. And we learned so much. It was like doing a crash course. So we managed, it's just amazing that we managed to find an ethical framework that suited this project so perfectly and is completely homegrown. So that brings me onto a little loop back of like, why didn't the other guidelines take root? And from the workshops, we gathered that it was because, as David mentioned, they weren't homegrown, that the tourism industry here that has animal attractions as its business are in a set of circumstances and have a background context that are very different to tourism in other parts of the world. And we learned that although we felt a little bit like pariahs at this stage in terms of our markets, our international markets' opinion of South Africa in the animal interaction space for tourists, I don't feel, having done this whole study, that we are anywhere close to the worst of what happens in the world. And that what we do have that doesn't come across so well shouldn't deter people and shouldn't tarnish everything that is done right. And also that it's by far not yet too late to remedy just a few little things and tweak it in a little bit of in a way that can actually really be advantageous to the facilities, to the activities, to the commercial operations, and to the destination South Africa. So we felt like these other guidelines weren't local, they weren't indigenous to us, and we discovered that, like also David said, people wanted to be consulted. And we found that's very much the African way. We have Lechotlas, we have Indabas, we have Bosberats. We go away and we discuss things. And so that's why we held these workshops, and that's why we discussed it so much in our networks and in our boards and with our partners in other associations that intersect with the tourism industry. Then thirdly, we realized that the guidelines also focus a lot on welfare, on animal welfare. And my feeling is that this is very much a Western and Northern and first world kind of thing. Like welfare is such a big deal there. And what it missed is, so these guidelines are that we have read from elsewhere are a lot on the welfare of animals in captivity. But that's not the story in South Africa. For the most part, we discovered, and it was quite humorous to us, how anybody that we thought either were doing great jobs or poor jobs, all of them seemed to love their animals. No one thought that anyone was doing anything wrong, and they really loved their animals. And in general, I'd have to say that the animals in tourism facilities in South Africa don't suffer from terribly bad welfare. But that's not our issue. Our issue is the bigger picture. Our issue comes back to the context. It comes back to some of the things that put the spotlight on us in the first place. So these are things like, where do the animals come from? Why are they in captivity? What is their use in captivity? What are they being used for? And what is that lifespan of use? And then where are they going when it's all done? So our study is the full life cycle of this conundrum, really, and not just poor animals, do they have the 5 freedoms while they are in captivity? So it's more comprehensive, and yet in the end a little less detailed, because these other guidelines, they actually have manuals on different sectors. I mean, they are comprehensive in the extreme. So nothing wrong with that, but they are very detailed in a certain area, and ours is less detailed, but in a broader spectrum. So that was the other thing with them, is like in the end we were also like, so why else haven't they been adopted and taken root here? We felt like, well, it is because they're too complex. In our consultation, people in tourism, and let's remember, this is a tourism industry doing a study. We are not an animal rights organization. We are not scientists. We are not politicians, and we are not activists. We are looking at it from a commercial perspective, from an industry perspective, but knowing that a lot of this industry are the custodians of what makes Africa and South Africa special. And we have this in our foreword of our document to say that in the long run, when the world is so geez, the time. When they're so overwhelmed with the synthetic nature of life and their instant gratification of everything, and everything's quite sterile and technological, Africa will be one of the only places left where they can go and seek a holiday where nature is intact in the ecosystems, and that getting away from tech is actually what tourism starts to be about. So we've got to protect that USP of Africa. And by manipulating and perverting the wildlife in the wild, where you don't get cell phone reception and where you have to be patient to get your sightings, and making it a quick fix that you can see them down the road in half an hour, and even touch them, whereas you can't get close in the wild. That's a perversion of what makes Africa special. So we were we're really looking at the long term, not just the short term tourist interests, and trying to be custodians of that as well. So lastly, why they didn't take root is because of these thick volumes of work, they weren't practical. So what I was saying about the tourism industry in our consultation, for the most part, our peers are very simple people. We're not, the highestly academic qualified people don't go into tourism. Scientists don't go into tourism. A lot of it's family businesses they inherited, especially in our more rural provinces. The provinces known for their wildlife are the less sophisticated provinces. So it's a simple industry, and giving this industry a report or a study that requires a huge amount of attention and dissection and understanding complicated terms is not really going to be effective. So when we do show you our documentation, we have a summary of our research report that is 25 pages of really nice, succinct report language. And then we have an interactive PDF, which is like a mini website where you can click on things and go directly to things and find things. And we've used language there that is much more casual, and we've bullet pointed it, and we've illustrated it a little bit to try and get the message across to people who don't have time to read a whole report, and they just want to see something that looks like it actually makes sense. So we were trying to also come up with something practical. So that comes to the next thing. So after the line in the sand and the ethical framework that we had to find, we then got to this thing of a tool. In our very early meetings, we decided that we didn't want to produce another set of guidelines for the industry. There are so many out there. So we decided the question that we had been asked all the time was, show me what I must, tell me what I must do. Just give me a list. No one wanted to really have to think too much about it. So we knew they wanted something practical that they could pick up and use. So we did a 1-year study. It took us about a year to get the funding sorted out and everything. So that's why it wasn't actually 2 years of work. 1 year of work that we knew we had to basically get down to 1 page. And so don't wonder how did SATSA take 1 year and they overshot their deadline and all we got was 1 page. That was the point. Okay, it was the point to get to something really simple. So what we got this down to is a decision tree that you could pick up very simply. So it says a tool that helps you rapidly identify what facilities or attractions tourists should support or avoid. Okay, and that's what it all came down to. So that is the long story. Now we're going to go into more of the detail. This is the launch of our report and our findings, but we're not actually going to take you through it. It's going to be made available to you, and we really want you to go and look at the detail, read the titles, the subtitles. They've all, they all convey very much what we want it to say on each of the pages. So I'm happy to go through some of the points, like what is the scope that we looked at, what is the purpose, and so on. But it's just like tidbits, really, from the better information. Excuse me. Yeah. So I've mentioned quite a bit. Yeah, so if I can just jump then, the first two... So very much, so when we had our workshops initially, we said we were going to look at everything. We were going to look at reptiles. We were looking at shark cage diving. We were happy to let anyone bring into the workshop what they wanted us to look at. And over time and through our studies, we must now announce that we really chiseled that down into something very simple, which was captive wildlife in tourist facilities and attractions. So in our document, we state that we're not looking at hunting. We're not looking at... domestic animals. We're not, there's a lot, we're not looking at, there's a whole list that are free roaming. So for example, shark cage diving actually in the end fell outside of our study because we were looking at animals that had no choice. They are enclosed in a captive environment. So we did narrow our study down a lot. So it's captive wildlife that are, the attractions and facilities are targeting tourists for their spend, and that includes, obviously, local visitors. I mentioned the second point. I mentioned the third, the full life cycle. And then, so, yeah, we're probing deeper than the care of the wildlife in the system and actually to the ethics and the transformation of the system. So this idea of ours of advancing that line in the sand is to actually try and see the transformation of the sector and understanding that with us SATSA having no legislative or regulatory power, that it's really the market is going to make this line in the sand move. And it's not really that SATSA chooses to or champions that we should or shouldn't. The fact is you have no choice. So this line is moving. It's already moved in the last 2 years, like I've said. So we are really looking towards how can we see this transformation take place in the right direction, and how can we assist in that process. Okay, so what it isn't, the Animal Welfare Guide, we don't address certain, it's not species specific. That point we've just spoken to. Okay, so here's a little bit of a diagrammatic representation of the line in the sand. So we can just have the first point. Yeah. Forward, right? Oops. I'm going to click twice. Okay, so we're looking at the universe of captive animal attractions, and we're saying on the one very far end, you've got the stuff that we already know is pretty much unsavory, okay, to say the least. The canned hunting, the trade in animal parts, circuses that no one really goes to anymore. And this is what we were trying to talk about, how society has already moved, and we take it for granted that our parents went to circuses and stuff, and we really don't take our children to circuses anymore. We may have gone to dolphin shows and stuff, and we probably won't take our children to that anymore. There are certain things that society has just decided are not cool anymore. So you've got that on the one side. And then on the other side, we've got facilities that you actually want money to go to, and we want to see succeed because that will aid conservation. So those are the true types of sanctuaries and rehabilitation centers on the other end. Everything else fits in the middle, right? Somewhere in the middle. So this is this concept of there is an increasing moral sensitivity happening out there that we were tracing. So we were finding that there was this increasing moral sensitivity coming through social media and other market forces that we were hoping could lead to improved moral decision-making. And that's where the ethics policy sort of comes into this, that you're not basing it really on commercial values or emotional things, but you're basing it on sort of better moral decision-making. And that would then influence the change that we needed to see. So, like I said, we'll show you out of the ethical approach that we used how and where we drew this line in the sand, and then understanding that there are two forces on the line in the sand. There's this increasing knowledge an awareness and information around animal sentience, the value of wildlife, the whole engagement of humans and the planet, really, that is pushing in that direction. And then there's the commercial gain and self-interest pushing in the other. There's no other real reason to be pushing in the other direction. It really is livelihoods, employment, commercial viability, and not really conservation viability on that side of things. So we're looking at, in the past, where animal interests were subordinate to human interests. And that was the phrase that we really came up with, that the interests of animals should not be subordinate to the benefit that humans derive from their existence. That's really what it came down to. And so we're moving into a space with this increased moral sensitivity and the social movement pushing us that way, that we're getting into the space where animal interests will be on a par with human interests. Okay, so the ethical framework. Do you want to? You go ahead.
I don't know if this is working. Yes, it is. Okay, so we, as Kira mentioned, we battled long and hard to find an ethical framework that can really underpin any decisions that are made in the process. And it is very important that, as Kira also mentioned, that no matter who's in the room, there's a framework on which to base all decisions going forward. And after much soul-searching, we found the work of Professor David Bilchitz, who is a professor in constitutional law and from the University of Johannesburg. And I wanted to just quickly read out some of his credentials. He's also the director of the South African Institute of Advanced Constitutional, Public and Human Rights and International Law. And he's the current Secretary General of the International Association of Constitutional Law. So David has an approach that he has labeled the integrative approach. And this particular approach is rooted in African philosophy, and in particular, Ubuntu, which in actual fact, Ubuntu is not just about I am because you are, as we all tend to understand Ubuntu is, but Ubuntu is the African philosophy of recognizing that we are all equal and nobody should be treated, no people, nature, or animals should be treated at the expense of anyone else. So the ethical framework is focused on sustainable use and the conservation of animals, and it's specific to the relationship between animals, the environment in which they live, and their connection with human beings. Now, Kira, did you take the
yes, sorry.
So David, unfortunately, is unable to be with us tonight. We wanted him to be here, but he's in Ecuador at the moment. He's a very busy man. But we do have a clip where he describes the integrative approach, and we felt it was best if it comes from his mouth because it is his ethical theory.
So if I may just give you a tip, tune in now, listen very carefully. He talks quite fast. And this is the crux of a lot of our work. So he compares the integrative approach to what was previously widely adopted, the aggregative approach, which they both use the term sustainable use, but in different ways.
Firstly, let me say that the environmental rights in the Constitution nowhere actually clearly mentions animals, but animals are included within the notion of the environment as a whole. And in the second part of the environmental rights, it states that everyone has the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that prevent pollution and ecological degradation, promote conservation, and secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic and social development. And so the notions that I'm going to focus on, which have been so important in South Africa at the moment in environmental policy, are questions around particularly the notion of sustainable development and use, and the question of the notion of conservation. And I'm going to suggest that there are two ways we can approach these notions and interpret them. And this is perhaps not familiar to everyone around that a constitution doesn't just self-interpret itself. One actually needs to interpret what the notions mean. And people use these ideas in a way which they think is what it means, but nevertheless that might not be the constitutionally appropriate way to do so. And so I've suggested that one way is the dominant way which has been given, meaning that has been given to the notion of conservation and sustainable use. And this is what I call the aggregative approach. And the aggregative approach essentially sees the focus of conservation as being on the species as a whole and allows for the sacrifice of many individuals for this wider goal. And I contrast that with what I term the integrative approach. And the integrative approach focuses on the survival of both individuals and the species. It integrates, that's why it's called integrative approach, a relationship between respect for individuals and the survival of the species itself. An integrative view would reject the idea that the sacrifice of a range of individuals can advance the goal of species conservation. It would argue that respect for individuals is essential to preserving the species as a whole. Right, and the focus a lot of the time in the notion of the sustainable use is arguably on the use component, that elephants can be used for human purposes, for example, by having people sit on them and ride on them. But the question is that a sustainable use? And the alternative integrative understanding of sustainable use gives equal weight to the composite term sustainable and use. And the very approach to use must be such that it is conditioned to provide a future for the animal in question and recognize its role in a wider, holistic ecosystem. Okay? So this notion of sustainability, it would say that certain uses which ignore individual interests and welfare are harmful to sustainability. And it is only where the individual animal is respected and afforded protection for its interests that any use of an animal can become sustainable. Sustainable use enshrines on this approach a conception where any use is legitimate only if it is done in a manner compatible with respect for the entity in question that is being used. It would thus reject the killing of animals such as lions for mere pleasure or entertainment as constituting a form of sustainable use. So I presented you these two views because they represent strongly, very dominantly what exists very much in the sector at the moment. And the question is, of course, which one should be adopted, which approach should be taken. And I don't have time to make the argument in a lot of detail, but basically I would make the following arguments: that only the integrative approach should be adopted because, firstly, it addresses our ethical obligations to treat individual animals with respect in their own right. And that in itself is very important and something which increasingly is something that I think advocates for animals should stress as our ethical obligations towards them. But I argue a second argument is if one doesn't accept that one sees prima facie that the aggregative approach is actually attractive, that actually the aggregative approach in itself is self-defeating. That only the integrative approach can succeed in achieving the very goals sought by the aggregative approach, that is the long-term survival of the species. Why do I make that argument? Because I basically argue that only by encouraging an ethic of respect towards animals will we actually encourage a notion of will we be able to ensure their long-term survival. The aggregative view essentially renders animals as instruments to human ends, and as such, human purposes become primary in relation to them, and just like an inanimate piece of stone, there are hardly any moral limits that can be done to them. And so in the long run, any aggregative approach towards animals actually undermines their long-term survival or sustainability. And interestingly enough, we've been bolstered by the Constitutional Court in this, which has effectively told us that we must accept and adopt the integrative approach, that animals themselves have inherent value as individuals, and that matters of welfare and conservation are intertwined and must be considered together.
Apologies for the poor quality. But I think what is key, and I've picked up in the last sentence that he put there, is that the integrative approach has actually been adopted by the Constitutional Court. So we, as an industry, are basically required to follow the integrative approach. It might not have been translated into all of our laws yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, I think that that for us was quite a revelation, that not only is it homegrown, it ties into, and you'll see in our document, much easier to follow than his long description, but we've really summarized that aggregative approach and integrative approach really well. We've also put in the section of the Constitution that he mentioned in our Bill of Rights, and also the Concourt statement that came out of a case where he testified. So just in terms of, also any, we know that this guide won't be popular with everyone, the findings won't be popular with everyone, but we actually, in a way, as a industry body, are obligated to really follow the law and show our industry this is actually what we are bound by, and definitely where the future is going. So, some people might not even realize this is out there. I didn't know that this Concourt decision was out there. So that really, really helped us focus and frame our work along the integrative approach, which now Leanne will take you through the questions and how we got to our framework.
So emanating from the integrative approach are 8 simple questions that we all need to ask ourselves about captive animal experiences. And the first question is it really in the best interest of the animal to be in this facility or to be in captivity? The second question, was the acquisition of the animal in the best interests of the animal and conservation? The third question, is it in the best interest of each animal and conservation to actually remain in the facility or in captivity going forward? Does the activity or the facility where the animal is kept interfere with the natural capabilities or behavior of the animals? Is the activity natural for the animal? So this is down to an actual activity. Are they asking them to do something that's unnatural? Does the animal have freedom of choice to be involved in the activity? Is it make sure it's not coerced or managed or restricted in any way to be forced into the situation? Was or is the animal negatively affected in any way pre, during, or post the activity? And then finally, the 8th question, is there any real educational or conservation value in the activity that cannot be achieved better by any other means? So it's 8 simple questions. And what the committee did is they took these questions and applied it to the breadth and width of the types of activities and attractions that we have in this country that came out of all the workshops that many of you were at. And we applied these questions, and by doing that, we were able to categorize the activities and attractions into 3 different categories. We have the unacceptable category. And in this case, the ideal answer was not achieved for the majority of the questions. Okay, and in this case, based on the integrative approach, we're saying that these facilities should not be supported. Then we had the unclear, where there were a lot of unanswered questions. We didn't know enough. There wasn't enough information, so there was no immediate answer. We have to go and ask more questions. We have to go and probe more. And we also recognize that there might be some of your own individual people's own individual moral judgments might come into play. So what I might consider to be acceptable, somebody else might not, depending on how they answered those questions. And here we said, visitors or anybody wanted to consider these that fall into the unclear zone, they need to be cautious. They need to ask more questions around those 8 questions, plus other questions that we have provided in the guide. And then finally, we've got the group of acceptable. And here, this is when the ideal answer was reached for the majority of the questions. And we're saying when they fit into the acceptable realm, these should be supported, because the money that has been received from visitors is working towards supporting the individual animals in captivity. And ideally, as time goes on, we are hoping, and we do believe, that the size of the acceptable group is going to grow as those who've got captive attractions are going to advance what they're doing, change what they're doing, and move into the realm of the acceptable. And the size of the unacceptable and the unclear is actually going to shrink. Okay. So when we did all of this, it became quite clear that there were certain activities that, no matter which way we looked at it, upside down, wrong way around, the whole way, there were certain activities that were just not acceptable. So it comes down to performing animals, any animals doing an unnatural behavior, any tactile interactions with any infant animals, walking with predators or elephants, tactile interactions with predators or cetaceans, so your marine mammals, and then any riding of wild animals. So these became our unacceptable list. And what the next slide is going to show you is that one pager that Kira mentioned about the tool. That tool that is going to help the industry and anybody or tourists themselves who are wanting to make a rapid decision about who do I support or who to avoid. And this is the tool. It does go, we have a very nice interactive PDF version of this, which we'll show you at the end. But essentially, it's a decision tree with your first question basically asking you to check whether the facility is in any way, if it's a sanctuary or a rehab center. And we're quite clear on the fact that just because they've got the name sanctuary or rehab center in their name doesn't mean that they are a sanctuary or rehab center. And we give a whole lot of requirements in order to be a sanctuary or rehab center. And if they are, we're saying they would go straight into the support zone. So you don't need to go through the other questions. So we're talking about no breeding of animals, no trading, no performing animals, no tactile interactions with at all. They're there because they were sick, injured, orphaned, rescued, or abandoned. They have a home for life or will be used for repopulation, reintegration, relocation as part of a conservation program, and that's compliant, obviously, with all relevant legislation. If that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean it's out. So we're saying go to question number 2. Question number 2 is, do they offer any of these activities that we've already discussed that we're saying are unacceptable? And if they do, we're saying that at that point you go straight to avoid, don't bother with the rest of the questions. We're saying that activity and that facility should be avoided. If the answer is no, we're going to consider the destination of the animal. Where is it going to? So we're asking, we understand that some of these questions are not going to be easy to answer. But the intention is to raise awareness and to prick sensitivities around people to actually start asking questions and start probing deeper. So we're asking questions on, are the animals going to end up in can hunting, trade in body parts, or any illegal trade? So, yeah, you might not know the answer, but you can probe and you can do some more research. Is there breeding of lions and tigers? So if it's a yes, we're saying avoid. If we know or not sure, we're saying then let's consider the marketing of the facility. Is there any indication of misleading advertising, deceptive behavior, or lack of transparency? Yes, go to avoid. No, consider compliance for any illegal operations. And then finally down to question number 6, which is considering the source and the reason. And here we're asking, are any of the animals wild captured, purchased, bred in activity, or traded commercially? Is any animal's freedom of choice to participate in a tourist activity restricted in any way? And are any of the animals kept in captivity only for tourism or entertainment purposes? At this stage, based on the current line in the sand, a yes to any one of these 3 questions puts you into the support zone, but it's an orange zone. And a no to all goes into the green zone. So that's the tool in a nutshell. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, sorry. I keep forgetting when I start speaking what I sound like. So what you will see is that this, in a way, is not a very radical position, because those things that we identified as unacceptable are pretty much accepted in the broader public, in the wider world, in the let's say the echelon of people that travel internationally and locally. Those kinds of things are slipping into the generally accepted unacceptable zone. So you might wonder why it's the line is drawn there, that only those activities that we spoke about are actually, in this study, termed unacceptable. So this is where we're talking about, like, in future, when perhaps welfare of our animals does become more of a focus, and any new things happen. Like, I remember as a kid growing up, I never thought African animals could be ridden. You had to go to Thailand if you wanted to do that, because I just like, well, you can't do it in Africa. And then by the time I was in this industry as an adult, you could ride elephants. So things might change and things might come up that would have to, we'd have to look at and run with at the time that they start to emerge. Because also, as certain things get ruled out, other kinds of things pop up. And these might very well be just positive things, and that's what we're hoping, that business opportunities, the creativity of South Africans, of what to do, will actually encourage a change of behavior in a really positive direction. So, yeah, okay, so although this comes first in the document, what we found, having reached this decision tree, is that we thought, like, well, everyone can use it, but we're going to take this forward with different pieces of marketing for 4 different audiences. So at the moment, and our study looked at, the guidelines would be for obviously the visitors, the tourists themselves, foreign or local. And why? Because we've given those questions. They want to have an objective and reliable source of what to visit and what not to visit, and helped with making that decision. Then obviously the owners, either the business owners or the owners of the animals that are attracting tourists. And why? Just realizing that the social movement has overtaken you, and it's moving fast, and you actually need to understand it and want to know what you can do about it to keep alive in the industry. Then there are the buyers, the DMCs locally and the big DMCs overseas, the destination management companies, tour operators, local and international, and the assorted travel industry. Those are what we call in the study the buyers. And these are very influential people. These are the guys that get your product in a small town or a rural province into the brochures of the big tour operators in Europe. And they are some of the loudest voices in SATSA's ear saying, we need help. We don't know what we should send our clients to, what we should put in our brochures. So as locals, as the South Africans, we have to listen. These guys have a huge amount of influence on our economy and on the success of our industry. So there we go. We realize that some of them might not even be doing it because they have high morals, but it could also be driven by an economic imperative, and also that they might not want to flout rules. A lot of UK travel agents are forced to sign the ABTA guidelines, in which case they wouldn't be able to use a lot of attractions and facilities, but they don't know how to establish that from sitting in a desk overseas. And then all the representatives, those are industry bodies, government at all levels, and the tourism information agents and officers around the country. And that comes to our biggest task as the committee. We weren't just accountable to SATSA and the members, but we actually were also accountable to South African tourism, who wanted a study done to see also what they needed to do to improve brand South Africa. That was really getting hammered and is still getting hammered. So this is also for the big guns. They are in charge of the budget that spends money on advertising our destination. So they're going to take heed of the study as well and decide how to paint the picture for South Africa around wildlife attraction, which is what is bringing tourists here in the first place. Okay. So lastly, the way forward. Mentioned it a little bit, but just to reiterate that fortunately or unfortunately, SATSA is not a regulatory body, so we can't pass this as the rules or the laws or anything like that. You can't expect of SATSA, you can't expect these guidelines to have as far a reach, but we will be adopting it, taking it to the board in terms of what it means for SATSA membership. Then we've spoken about that. We've spoken about the third point as well. So now really important to us is that SATSA now has an expectation. We have an expectation of South African tourism, of the department, the National Department of Tourism, and of our Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry, and now, of course, our Agricultural Department, which has jumped into the fray in the last 2 weeks with their announcements. So it's really the extent to which we can talk to the authorities above us and to our peers in the industry and private sector that to try and see to what extent this guideline, this line in the sand, the desire to move it forward, to what extent will that be adopted, and how much influence can SATSA have over that? But we want to say that we're committed to it. If anything, I've learned that in the last year, SATSA is really committed to this, and we want to see this continue. So that's about it from our side. Oh, is there one more slide? I don't think so. It was just like the little blurb. That one. Okay, cool. Should we are we showing them the document in the... Okay, so I thought we'd just show you, this is a Mac. We'll just show you what the guideline looks like, and also that decision tree we've put into a format that is usable on mobile phone. So we were anticipating, like some press will reference, where can you find these things? It'll go to a link that goes to SATSA's website. So that's where you all are going to find them. We didn't have budget to print it all for the launch. So you'll go to the website, you'll download the interactive PDF of the guide, and then this of the tool only. But this, when you open it on your phone, you can go through that decision tree in the same step by step, but it just scrolls. Because obviously getting that whole diagram with all the lines and the blocks, if you look at that on a cell phone, which a tourist will, you won't be able to read anything. So this, comes out differently on a Mac. Okay, so these are actually on 2 different pages. But basically it takes you on a page to the questions, and you go yes or you go no. And the no's, you scroll onto the next page. Okay, I don't know why page 4 is up already. And it'll go through page 5 and then to page 6. It's exactly the same, but simplified into a page-by-page format. And this is what we will make into a pocket guide for visitors, for owners, for buyers, and for the representatives. All right. So just to give you an example, I can't. But basically the buttons, apart from the contents page being clickable, you can jump to the section you want. At any stage, you can go back to the top and click on, again, the section that you want. The contents obviously tells you what each section covers. And then there's a back. You can't see, there's a back and a next button at the bottom, which will take you through the document as well. And then at any time that something's hyperlinked, it will take you there as well. And I just want to show you there. So this section here where we go into the scope and we explain why not welfare, this link to ABTA and to Fair Trade Tourism will take you to their guidelines. So if you are particularly interested in very thorough guidelines on welfare, then we actually recommend these guys. We honor the work that they did, and we are by no means competition to what they've done. So we actually want to have it accessible to you as well. And that's, I won't scroll through more because basically I want you to look at it yourselves and go through it this evening. Okay. So SATSA tells us that the PDFs, both the tool and the guide, will be available from tomorrow morning on the SATSA website. Oh, it is. Thanks, honey. So you can go to SATSA. There's a link on the front page to actually see the full PDF version and the little tool. I know that cocktails are calling, but we did say that there would be time for questions. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Willie Jacobs. I'm the owner of
Ukutula.
My name is Willie Jacobs. I'm the owner of Ukutula Lodge.
I was just wondering that there are activities which we're involved in, research activities which necessitate a restricted breeding program, because most of our research is based on reproductive research technology. So how would a facility like mine, where we do have a limited restricted breeding program under veterinary and even university supervision, give an honest answer to the question, are we involved in breeding?
If you read the tool and the information, it does talk about conservation programs and purposes and research purposes. And we do have definitions, by the way. So there's quite a lot of definitions, because there's obviously we're utilizing quite a lot of words, so we need to make sure that everybody's on the same page of what a predator is, etc. And when we talk about conservation programs, we talk about the fact that it's obviously it's for the primary purpose of ensuring the survival of each specimen in the wild, of the specimens in the wild. And it should be in accordance with the conservation strategy or research program approved by a recognized issuing authority or recognized biodiversity management plan. And it must have been evaluated for its ethical and welfare standards and conforms to the principles of the 4R framework. So if you can tick those boxes with providing evidence, then it's according to our definitions, it falls within a...
And also remember that research can go on in many places without tourists. So we're looking particularly at tourist attractions where tourists are paying money for an experience. So if you are, I mean, we don't have to discuss everybody's business in detail, but that's just also a difference between research and between tourism and appealing to tourists. And I think your question also comes down to the one lower down in that tree about transparency. And then people can make their own choices. If they know the facts, they make their own choices. Before we have Lee again, anyone else? If no, April, I'll come.
Horses are wild, horses are domesticated, elephants are wild, elephants are domesticated, and there's probably other animals in the same situation. And it must be difficult, therefore, to make a decision. I mean, I've seen places in some countries where elephants are domesticated and being treated very badly, and other areas where you pay to see what's going on, where they're coming down to the water to drink, but they're working in the fields and this sort of thing. How do you differentiate between those? Because it must be a very difficult line to do.
So again, the definitions are in the fuller document. And also remember that we focus the study in a very specific geographical area. So the animals that are relevant in our area, in our ambit, and our tourist attractions. And the definitions of wild and domesticated and the animals that fall into our study and don't are listed in the document. Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know that this is a question. It's more really a remark about what the gentleman just mentioned about animals being either domesticated or wild. And I think we need to be very cognizant of the difference between domesticated and tame. Elephants and lions are not domesticated. They are tamed wild animals, and that is a huge, huge difference. The only animals that are domesticated are dogs and cats.
And horses.
So I just want to clarify that as well. We don't differentiate between domesticated. We talk about domestic animals and wild animals.
Yes, and then
I actually also don't really want to ask a question, but just add a comment. You've mentioned that it's based on the ethical framework by this gentleman from UJ. I don't dare say his name.
It took us a long time.
But where animal rights are sort of equal to human rights. Now, and you said it's part of our law and we must abide by the law. My question now as a zoologist is, aren't we a bit hypocritical, especially when looking at the hospitality industry, where do you, it again comes down to classification. The hospitality industry is totally supporting the red meat industry. And animals are classified as wild or agricultural animals now, with the 33 species wild animals also now being classified as agricultural. So do they lose their rights? So it is just a question of, I put you in this box, and you may have integrated ethical fall into the integrated ethical framework and laws. I put you in this box and suddenly everything disappears. And in the hospitality industry, I can eat duck bowls and it's fine, but I can't walk with an animal or sit with an animal because a duck is agricultural.
I understand
you
the
understand.
Yeah.
So again, this line in the sand for me is, either we give the animals rights and we respect them, or we don't.
Yeah. So it's a good point. So I must just state here, and before I respond, because it's on my mind, that a lot of these kinds of questions and things came up in our workshops. So we can't now go back and revisit stuff that we covered, but I'll respond to that thing. Going back to the idea of the study being about animal interactions in the tourism industry. So we're not taking a position on veganism and vegetarianism and, you know, all of that side of things. Similarly to how we didn't incorporate hunting, which is even closer in more relevance than farmed cattle. So really just remember that we are talking about where an activity or an interaction with a captive wild animal is on offer to a tourist to make money from it.
I understand. That's why I just. You've mentioned the social movement that is, and I think this is going to catch up with the tourism industry as well. You can't put one group of animals and really respect them, and the others, it's okay, we humanely slaughter them. You understand? So if we look at society's morals, it's a really difficult thing, I think, to...
It's very difficult. Just our study showed us just in the when we focused it was still very complex, even with that focus. But I think when those kinds of things come down to individual choice, like if you choose to be a vegetarian, then fine, you probably won't go to an animal interaction anyway. So, but I really think choices around ethical farming is different, and your eating habits is different to what this study was about. There was a question here, and then really you did have one, and I know, David, probably you want to wrap up.
I just would actually like to direct my question at you. So you mentioned just now that this research is obviously to establish who is offering interaction activities to make an income. So someone like myself, I'm from All Arts Foundation, we own Wolf Sanctuary. We offer interaction, but that is to sustain, because if we don't offer that package, 150 Rand, getting a couple people in to do the educationals, it's great, we love it, but it's not going to power rent, it's not going to feed our animals, it's not going to keep the roof over their head. So someone like us who also focus on the 5 freedoms, we're non-profit, we stick to all of the animal rights guidelines, that's what we stand for, will lose, and our animals will end up suffering long term.
Did you self-disqualify yourself in that tree?
Yes, I had to.
At what point?
At offering the animal interaction. So it's more about observing, when you come in and you interact.
So I think that's exactly where we're saying there are such tiny little tweaks to be made to something that can continue being extremely viable and get better kudos and better reputation in the bigger picture of tourism by staying abreast of these developments and of these waves. I don't think that there's anything right now that you would just tomorrow close because of it, that there are ways to really keep it going and to achieve the educational value and the conservation value, the shelter value in the project going. David? Okay,
Can
so
I add
one more from Fair Trade.
a good example to that might help her? Obviously, through the Fair Trade guidelines, we went through very similar questions. We had a member that did walking with cheetahs, and through our recommendations, we wanted to kind of separate that, and that was a big income generator for them. So what they've done is they've adapted their business to not do walking with cheetahs. The cheetahs still need to walk to get exercise, but they've actually built a human path through a forest where they have added extra things like education on the fynbos in the area, and on a whole lot of other things, and they've adapted it, making a much more interesting walk, and then the cheetahs come with the guide on, and they walk at their own pace and their own freedom. And there's viewing spots where you can see the cheetahs walk past, but there's now a barrier between the animal and the human. So it's still an amazing experience, but it takes away that initial walking with.
Like I said, I think there's infinite creativity in South Africans. I really do. And it does. And I also, oh no, I lost my train of thought. Infinite creativity. And then in the case studies that we looked at, just the 5 of us sitting around a table were sparking off with ideas about what could be done to even grow like the revenue in a place that was doing things that maybe fell on the wrong side of the line, and with a few tweaks, do this, and you would actually get more business than you even started with. So I really think there's room and scope, and I really think the two sides should just talk to each other, because though each side knows what they need, you need the income, the other side needs people to feel like they are supporting valid causes and not causing undue stress on animals. You talk to each other and you'll come up with solutions, I have no doubt. Okay, David.
Just one quick question. I'm trying to understand it. One of the no's is walking with animals.
There's a specific, I think it does specify.
Yeah, it's one of them is no walking with
predators.
Predator.
Predators and elephants.
Predators and elephants.
Yeah.
All right. But so the guide can walk with a predator or elephant, but the tourist can't.
I
Sorry?
did pick that up in what...
I don't know. I'm just trying to understand that.
Sorry, I did pick that up in what Fair Trade said, that the people still walk them. It's a very interesting point, because we did think about handlers and tourists, but we're particularly looking at the tourist interaction, because animals are under the care of humans in so many cases, and humans have to feed them, they have to take bloods, they have to check their stool, whatever, all the time. So there is at this point no getting away from the fact that animals are under the care of humans. And the welfare guidelines look closer at that. And we're looking at really the tourist interaction and the tourist role. Because let me tell you, the tourists, it's a little bit like bribery. I always think of that arms deal thing, that the South African politicians didn't, like the bribes, they were brought into bribe. The bribe comes from the offer of the bribe and the acceptor of the bribe. And it's a bit like animal interactions. You have the owners of the animals and you have the buyers. If the buyers didn't buy these interactions, there wouldn't be a trade in them. So buyers are really ignorant, and they so you have both sides playing. They're culpable from both sides. Yeah. Willie's last point. Willie.
It is interesting to note, Fair Trade have a policy where walking with predators is frowned upon, and understandably so. Having a cheetah on a leash, having the animal along with a whole bunch of tourists could be problematic. But lions that are sociable animals and that love the freedom of the bush, let out of their enclosures as a form of enrichment, is a fantastic activity which by enrichment experts have been described as the best enrichment for the animals. The alternative would be having the animals sitting in the enclosure all day. Here the animals get the opportunity. So what we've developed at Ukutula is a system whereby the animals do go on a walk under the supervision of animal handlers, which are trained, and then we have our visitors walking along at a distance as observers of the enrichment activity.
Willie, I don't think you don't have to justify your place
I'm
really,
just saying
because I
that
think
it
everybody then would want a chance to explain their facility. But thank you for your contribution.
Yeah, guys. So sure. End of a long afternoon. I want to thank you for your patience. this is sort of where angels fear to tread. This is we've got to go in and actually deliver on the mandate, and it's not going to amuse everybody, but I think it's an incredibly thorough process. And Kira and committee, I want to thank you tremendously for just the volunteerism and the hours, and Leanne for your involvement as well. And you know, as they've said, this whole issue will evolve. And as new things and new insights come in, this process can evolve. But we've got to take a stand, guys, at some stage and put something out there. And at no point is anybody holding a gun to anybody's head. This is a set of guidelines, and businesses must look at it and adapt accordingly. One of the most heartfelt testimonies, if you will, through the process was in George. Paul Swartz, Safari Ostrich Farm. He's the biggest ostrich baron in Oudtshoorn. 2 years ago, people were riding ostriches and petting them and everything. He's cut that all out. Nobody had to tell him. He realized that was uncool, and in order to sustain his business and thing, he actually cut that out and said, what else can we do with ostriches that is sustainable? And I mean, you know, it's a sort of a less contentious point than some of the other ones, but it's a great example of people just thinking and adapting. So this thing, we will still, if people want to comment on us, please write in. We need to hear from you. But at some stage, we've got to actually get the guidelines out, and I think it's going to serve us well as a destination. And I think the process that we've gone through and what has been unearthed is world class, actually. It's world class. You know, we talk about we're under the cosh with safety and security and perceptions about this country. We need good news stories, and I think this is a fundamental good news story that we can take with pride as South Africans and go and share it with the world.